This is Business Breakdowns. Business Breakdowns is a series of conversations with investors and operators diving deep into a single business. For each business, we explore its history, its business model, its competitive advantages, and what makes it tick. We believe every business has lessons and secrets that investors and operators can learn from, and we are here to bring them to you. To find more episodes of Breakdowns, check out joincolossus.com.
All opinions expressed by hosts and podcast guests are solely their own opinions. Hosts, podcast guests, their employers, or affiliates may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions.
Welcome back to Business Breakdowns. This is Matt Russell, and today we are diving into the economics of the Olympics. It's a timely episode with the Paris Games ongoing right now. And the economic reality for host cities is extremely poor. It's estimated that Paris is going to spend $9 billion for these 2024 games. Now, that's an improvement versus the $35 billion spent by Tokyo in 2020, the $60 billion spent by Sochi in 2014, and a similar number spent by Beijing in 2008. But even with that improvement, with Paris spending, let's say, $9 billion, it's a loss compared to the revenue that they'll generate, which is somewhere in the mid-single-digit billion dollars. Our guest today is Andrew Zimbalist, author and economics professor at Smith College. Andrew has written extensively on the economics of the Olympics, specifically for host cities, the poor reality, and what led us to this environment where cities are spending so much money and not receiving that same reward. Now, I think it's easy to step back and say, well, there's probably some long-term benefits here that aren't being captured in the economic story related to the games. And that was my initial thought. But when you look into the maintenance spend that is required for the upkeep of all of the infrastructure, the lack of follow-through with tourism, the lack of follow-through with the jobs market, it is a poor reality. Andrew brings us behind the curtain to share more about the IOC and the bidding process for the Olympics, how that has changed over time, and what has led us to this period of time where cities are spending so much money for this type of outcome. We also get into some of the success stories, where you have Los Angeles in the 80s and Barcelona in the early 90s, who found a way to make the economics a net benefit for them. It's a really fascinating discussion, and one of those episodes that leaves you thinking, what is the long-term viability of this? Andrew shares some of his ideas for solutions to the Olympics. But this is thought-provoking, to say the least. Now, please enjoy this episode. All right, Andy, excited to have you here. Very timely discussion. You have written a lot about the economics of the Olympics and some very, very interesting things over the course of many years, books, articles, and whatnot. And I thought a good place to start would just be to outline the core thesis or the core idea behind most of your writing. And then you and I can dissect the different angles throughout the conversation from there.
Well, I guess the singular most common theme in what I've written about is that cities that want to host the Olympics should be extraordinarily cautious, that it takes an enormously lucky alignment of the stars to come out even, let alone come out ahead. Most host cities end up losing billions and billions of dollars and suffer a good deal of disruption socially, economically, environmentally in the process. I think if you go back over the last 60 or so years of hosts, you do find one or two cases where they were able either to come out even or because of very particular and unique circumstances in terms of local political planning, they were able to benefit from hosting the games. But those are very rare cases. The most common case is that you're dealing with an international monopoly, the International Olympic Committee or the IOC. We have no world government that regulates the IOC. We have the United Nations. They're basically effete on all grounds, but certainly with regard to international Olympic competitions. There's nobody who regulates the IOC. They're an international monopoly. They have a great deal of power. How much power they have varies over time depending on their popularity, but they have a lot of power. And historically, they've been able to play cities off against each other, have cities compete to make proposals about the venues and the transportation and the amenities and so on about their city relative to other cities. And cities have, again, historically, not recently, but historically have engaged in vigorous competition with each other and end up making promises and commitments that cost billions and billions of dollars more than the revenue that they attract. There's always been this notion that even if there is a short-term loss, and the IOC will very rarely admit to that, instead of engage in accounting finagling to cover up the losses. But even when there are no losses, there's a tremendous amount of disruption that happens from the Olympic Games. And you have to, after you've made your commitments and you've built or renovated 20, 30, 40 venues, sometimes even more than 40 venues for the Games, you then have to maintain them. Or you can let them go to seed, or if you do temporary venues, then you have to dismantle them. But maintaining these venues involves a lot of cost and also involves the use of scarce urban real estate for facilities that didn't have an economically viable use before the 17 days of the Olympics and are very, very unlikely, therefore, to have an economically viable use after the Games. So there are all sorts of very complicated things that go on, and the odds are stacked against you. And hence, I go back to my initial statement. Cities need to be very, very cautious before they undertake this massive commitment.
You painted a very clear picture there, and I saw some of the statistics about the cost of maintaining some of those buildings that might cost $400 to $500 million just to build initially, and then another $10 to $30 million to maintain thereafter. So you're incurring that loss, not necessarily just at the time of the Olympics, but if you decide to maintain that building and infrastructure after the fact, you could be maintaining losses for a long period of time. We could start maybe just with the bidding process itself. And maybe over the course of time and history in terms of what that's looked like, it certainly seems to be the case over the past decade, maybe 20 years. This idea of the substantial cost that's associated with the Olympics has really come more into the mainstream. I think it's something that I've started to see more things written about, both the Olympics and the World Cup, and the substantial amount of money that it costs. How has that impacted the bidding process? What does the bidding process look like? How much competition is there? Anything that you could share and bringing us behind the curtain a bit there?
So the bidding process has changed. The IOC made a major change in 2019. And basically, just a very quick historical sketch, starting with the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico City, where there was a very large amount of student and political protest about various things connected to the Mexican government and to the university experience and expense. There was a very large protest. Just happened a week or so before the Olympics were to start. The government could not countenance that level of discord being on the world stage, and they suppressed it. And they ended up killing, I can't remember the numbers, but dozens of protesters were killed. It was a very ugly situation. It was also ugly because Mexico City had and still has terrible pollution. And it happens to be about 7,000 feet altitude. So that created issues for the athletes to compete, to depend upon their cardiovascular system, where the air was very light and the air was very polluted, was not something that was very favorable. So Mexico got a lot of bad publicity in 68. In 72, you had the Olympics in Munich, where there was the attack by terrorists on the Israeli compound. 11 Israelis were killed. I think some of the terrorists were killed as well. So that was a very ugly Olympics, did not provide positive imagery, positive feedback for Munich. And following that, we had the situation, the IOC had awarded the 1976 Winter Olympics to Denver, Colorado. They'd actually gone through the competition and they said, Denver, you win. Wonderful. You're so lucky you won. Then the people of Denver called for a plebiscite or referendum, which they had, and they voted it down. They thought it was too expensive and that environmentally it was too unsound. So you had the Montreal Olympics in the summer of 76 that ended up going more than 10 times over budget. Also, there was a lot of corruption involved there that was extant and publicized. So all of a sudden, the Olympics, which had been this wonderful jewel for a city to get, started getting a worse and worse reputation. So fewer and fewer cities in the mid and late 70s were willing to bid. And finally, along comes Los Angeles and says they'll host in 84, but they'll only host under certain conditions. And one of those conditions is that they weren't willing to guarantee any losses. And the IOC had no choice. They went along with it. But what happens in Los Angeles is that Peter Ueberroth is the CEO of it. He develops a new model for corporate sponsorships. The amount of money they garner from that goes way up. He's organizing the games in Los Angeles, the second largest city and the entertainment capital of the United States. And they also happen to have UCLA and USC, major Division I sports programs that therefore they have major stadiums and arenas and swimming competition venues. And it turns out, because of good management, because of the unique circumstances, because of bargaining leverage that Los Angeles had vis-a-vis the IOC, turns out that they generated a nice surplus. Wasn't massive, but it was a surplus. And all of a sudden, the bad publicity that had accumulated over the previous 12 years or so became good publicity. And once again, cities started to clamor to be able to enter the competition to bid to host the games. And that pretty much continued through the remaining years of the 20th century. There was also a positive experience in Barcelona in 1992. So the Olympics became very popular, and typically the IOC would make the announcement, okay, it's time to bid to host the games that are 8 years or 10 years down the road. And they'd get 5, 6, 7, 8 cities entering the competition at the beginning. What happened, though, is more and more cities were competing openly, and the Olympics were expanding, and technology was changing, and expectations about luxury and beauty and shine would grow. The expenses went out of control. And all of a sudden, you have situations like Beijing in 2008, where they're spending $45 billion to host the games. And then you have Sochi, Russia, for the Winter Games in 2014. They're spending somewhere between $51 and $65 billion. So more and more cities are starting to feel reluctant that this thing has gotten much too expensive. Where cities are spending for the Summer Games, they're spending 15, 20, 25 and up $billion. On the revenue side, they're getting some money from international television and sponsorship deals that the IOC signs, but not that much. They get $1 billion to $1.5 billion. They sell tickets, and that could be anywhere from $750 million to $1 billion. They sell domestic sponsorship. You add it all up, and how much revenue comes in? Somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 or $5 billion for the Summer Games, and a bit less for the Winter Games. So you have, on the one hand, you've got $4 or $5 billion in revenue. On the other hand, you're looking at costs when you count all that needs to be counted, because very often they just count a slice of it. But when you count everything needs to be counted, you got costs that, depending on which Olympic Games we're talking about, 15, 20, 25, 30, up to perhaps $60 billion with Sochi. That's not a very good economic balance, and cities start having second thoughts. Some places you have plebiscites or referenda where the population votes down. Some places the city council votes it down. Some places there are petition drives and they vote it down. And all of a sudden, instead of having 5, 6, 7, 8 cities bidding, you've got 2 or 3 cities, or even 1 or 2 cities bidding. And indeed, what happened in 2017 is that 5 cities dropped out of the competition. They had entered the competition and they dropped out. And the IOC is left with a choice between Los Angeles and Paris. This is in 2017, so we're talking about the competition to host the games this week, 2024. And Los Angeles, in the middle of this competition, makes a statement, and they say that if we don't get the games, if we don't get the host in 2020, we're not going to host. We're not interested in subsequent years. The IOC then is facing a situation where they might have nobody coming to their party to bid for the 28 games. So instead, they go to Los Angeles and they say, how would it be if we committed today, or not today, but when we make our announcement later in 2017, we'll commit to having you be the host in 2028. We'll let Paris, because it's their centennial, they hosted the games in 1924. We'll let them do it in 2024. And we'll give you payments up front to cover some of your costs and to promote youth sports in Los Angeles. Under those conditions, Los Angeles said, okay. And the IOC did something they'd never done before, which is to announce the Olympic hosts for 2 successive games going forward. Subsequent to that experience and that situation, which was embarrassing, and they faced something that was potentially even more embarrassing going forward. Subsequent to that, the IOC decides that they're going to change their bidding process. It's too embarrassing to them to allow this open process to continue, which historically, it was like running a 100-meter dash. All these people are competing. Who's going to win? Nobody was competing. So the IOC decided, since we've lost the fanfare that we seek, we're going to start having bids in private, and all of the discussions will happen in private. And that way, if the city decides not to bid, or the city decides to drop out, or people start protesting, that'll be all undercover. It'll be under wraps. Nobody will see it. And we'll simply make deals on the side with these cities. We won't have open bidding. And then we'll announce it. When the city agrees, when the city finally gets its bid up to a level that's acceptable to us, we'll announce it. So now, since 2019, there's no more open competition. The games in Brisbane, Australia, that were awarded for 2032 those games were awarded in the secret behind the curtain process. They simply announced at some point that Brisbane was going to be the host. Brisbane has not been very happy about that, and it still remains to be seen what will transpire.
There's always a signal in terms of what's happening in public versus what's happening in private. It tells you something about the negotiating process, the leverage of the negotiating process, and at least trying to create that type of environment. What is Brisbane not happy with in terms of the process that you just alluded to?
Interestingly, Melbourne, Australia, was slated to host the next Commonwealth Games. And people started looking at the costs and the potential benefits and the disruption, the commotion, security issues. And they said, we don't want to do it. And they simply canceled after they had said they were going to do it. They just canceled. So people in Brisbane started asking similar questions. The plans in Brisbane, initially they come out with, the city says, okay, we're going to bid historically when it was still public. And they hire an architectural company to make some fancy drawings. And they say they've got it all figured out. And then when they get into it and they have to start to award contracts for things, and not just building sports venues, but they have to build roads. There's a transportation infrastructure that has to be built. There's a telecommunications infrastructure that has to be built. There's a hospitality and security infrastructure that has to be built. So then they start getting into it and they say, well, wait a minute, those beautiful plans that we drew up really aren't what we wanted to do. We have a better idea now. We're going to make it even better and bigger. So they start switching out the plans. In Brisbane, their plans, it's going to be hard for me to describe it. Their initial plans were to have 4 clusters of Olympic venues and to create linkages between them for transportation. And by the way, the IOC executives always demand that there's special lanes on the highways or the roads for them so they don't get hit by any traffic. And they demand other amenities for themselves too. So it's more complicated than simply building roads for common use. It's a special service that they require. Anyway, Brisbane started looking at the costs and looking at the uncertainty that in fact surrounded doing all of this. And people started to raise questions. And there was a fairly lively debate about whether they'd want to pull out altogether. So who knows what will end up happening there.
You have mentioned some of the commitments that cities have to make to the IOC. But when it comes down to the actual agreement, is it mostly driven by infrastructure and we agree to build X, Y, Z based on this plan? Is there any monetary commitment in terms of how much they're actually going to need to spend? And where I'm getting is it feels like some of these cost overruns might be driven more by the cities themselves than by what the IOC is demanding of them. Is that a fair statement?
I think it's driven by both. The IOC has so many demands. And by the way, the bidding process never was one city says, I'll bid $15 billion, and the next city says, no, I'll bid $16. Never in money. It was always in venues, the number of venues, the specialization of the venues, the amenities of the venues, and then the cost of the venues. So if you say to the IOC, we're going to build 17 venues, then you add up the projected costs, and then you get your bid, or you get part of your bid. Because as I just said, it's much more than just building the venues. So it's not an amount of money. But what the IOC requires for the summer games is somewhere around 35 to 40 venues. And it depends because each of the hosts gets to have the introduction of experimental new games. So the United States will get to reintroduce baseball in 28 for the games in Los Angeles. So somewhere between 35 and 40 venues. Typically, the process has been something like the following. Politicians, in order to get political approval, a mayor, a county commissioner, country president, they've got to put forward a plan that looks somewhat reasonable. In putting forward that plan, what they like to do is put forward a bare bones plan without any bells and whistles. Then once there's political approval, then they start adding the bells and whistles. So a project that was supposed to cost whatever, $7 billion, all of a sudden it's costing $10 or $20 billion. So part of that is just the political process. In order to get approval, you can't put out a really large price at the beginning. Part of it is that we're talking about a system that operates where the games used to get awarded 7 years in advance. Now they're saying it could be less than that or it could be more than that. Obviously, Brisbane, which is in 32, is more than that. It was awarded a couple of years ago. But during the course of 5 years or 7 years or 10 years, we have inflation. And one of the strongest areas of inflation is in construction costs. So there's just a process of prices going up from that. There's also, inevitably, there's corruption going on. Some places there's a little bit of corruption. Some places there's a lot of corruption. But you've got an organizing committee. And usually the organizing committee has already involved bigwigs from the construction industry, from development companies, construction companies, And those people have an enormous amount of power because they're going to be doling out, giving out contracts, signing contracts worth billions and billions of dollars. So they get paid. They get paid off. Just give the contract to this company. Here's $1 million. Give the contract to this. We'll make sure your son gets good work in the future, whatever it is. So that is a process that escalates the costs as well. And then I think there's just some honest reconfiguring that goes on. It's enormously complicated to do this. You're talking about, you have to build an Olympic village that's going to house somewhere in the neighborhood of 13 or 14,000 individuals. About 11,000 of them are athletes, and there are coaches and managers and so on. So you have to build an Olympic village. The Olympic village isn't just dormitories. It's cafeterias and restaurants and tracks and weight rooms. It's polyclinics. It's entertainment venues. You're actually building a village. You're not just building a tenement building. And it's enormously expensive. It could be $2 or $3 billion quite easily to do that. That's complicated. You have to build a media village. You have to build a telecommunications center. You have to renovate your airport or build a new wing in your airport. Then you've got to think about, so you're going to have maybe 25,000 directly connected to the Olympics, but then you have tourism. All the people who are going to come from surrounding cities and other countries that are come. And it's usually figured to be somewhere in the millions, the number of people who are going to come to the city. And particularly in a day like today, politically, where we have so much international instability, you've got a tremendous security situation on your hands. You've got millions of people running around the city, going from one venue to another. If somebody wants to make a political group or a terrorist group wants to make a political statement, where better to do it? You've got the world's attention. So in Paris, they're going to have somewhere, I've seen different figures. I've seen a figure of around 50,000. I've seen a figure of around 80,000 security personnel who are going to be staking out the grounds. And it's not just the personnel, but it's also military equipment and high technology and drones and so on that are going to be hopefully protecting people's safety. And then you've got to feed all the athletes and you got to move the athletes around. By the way, for the games in Paris in the coming weeks, they're going to have the surfing competition in Tahiti. That's not next door to Paris. You got to move the athletes around within a city and between cities. It's an enormously complicated situation. I've spoken to Casey Wasserman, who's the chairperson of the LA Games, many times about this. He's a really smart guy. He's well informed and he's a great businessman. And every week he's confronting some new issues that he never thought of before. So it's an enormously expensive and complicated thing. And that's another element that contributes ultimately to the cost overruns. And the typical cost overruns since 1960 for the Summer Games is 250%. Prices going up more than double.
And I think I read that every single game since 1960 have had cost overruns.
Yeah, every single game, with the caveat that there's some games that we don't have data for, like when Moscow hosted in 1980, we don't have adequate data. And the data that we had going back to the 60s is not as comprehensive as it is today. But yes, basically that's the case. They always have cost overruns.
Incredible. And I think you pointing out the logistical challenges and all of this paint a very clear picture in terms of not just the building and construction, but much, much, much more in terms of managing this with major question marks in terms of what you do after the Olympics end as well. The IOC has come up several times here. What is the economic arrangement for the IOC itself? Any details on that body? Is it one of these nonprofits? Is it a profit-seeking entity? Are there revenue share agreements? What can you share about their own economic arrangements?
The IOC is a nonprofit. The top executives, like the president and the vice president, they don't receive a salary. Thomas Bach, the president, gets all of his expenses paid for wherever he goes. Juan Antonio Samaranch, who was 2 presidents ago and had been president of the IOC for a couple of decades, he wanted to be treated like he was a prince. And he, on a permanent basis, he rented a loft in the most expensive hotel in Lausanne. They get treated very well. Obviously, he gets private plane service and everything else he wants. But they don't receive a salary. And there's nobody who owns the IOC who gets to take home profits at the end of the year. What the IOC does is it pulls in maybe $4 or $5 billion for the Summer Games every time they're held. Most of that money is then redistributed to international sports federations and national Olympic committees. It doesn't stay in the IOC, where the IOC, again, has stockholders who get dividends or profits or capital gains. That's not how it works. There's a staff at the IOC that is very well remunerated that operates in Switzerland. There's about 100 members on the International Olympic Committee itself. A large share of those members are very wealthy, very well-connected business people. Some of them are royalty. They have royalty connections. There are a handful that are just normal people who were previous athletes or had other connections. But basically, it's a group of very elite individuals who derive not salary, but all sorts of amenities and perquisites from being on the committee. They, of course, get free transportation, business or first class to all of the events that the IOC holds, not just the Olympics, but other events. They get gifts and other awards. Historically, it used to be a lot more corrupt. And since they were voting on who would be the next host, they get big time payoffs. But I'm of the belief that that has abated.
One of the things that stood out in some of your writing was this graph chart, which showed the broadcast revenue and the share that the IOC was capturing relative to the host city. It sounds like some of that share is actually being redistributed after the fact. But can you share a bit more about those dynamics with broadcast revenue, which seems like it's a pretty big chunk. It's a large number as it relates to the economics of the games and what's happening there.
So the IOC signs usually multi-year contracts with international and national television networks. The largest one is NBC in the United States. They've had a long-standing relationship with NBC, and they garner $4 or $5 billion in international television revenue. As that number has gone up higher and higher, they've shared a smaller and smaller portion of it with the host city. So the host city these days gets about 20% of whatever that international number is. The rest of it, about 10% of it, goes to maintaining the IOC and its operations, providing all the benefits that I was just talking about. And then there's another roughly 70% that is distributed to the International Olympic Movement, to the international sports federations, and also to national Olympic committees.
And those national committees, just so I understand what's happening there, those dollars then get used by those committees. How? Is it for athlete training? Is there something else that's going on?
So in the United States, we have the USOPC. It used to be USOC. So it's United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. It's based in Colorado. And they provide support for the sport federations in the country so that they can carry on their programs. Increasingly, the athletes in these various programs get remunerated. You get a salary. They get bonuses if they win, prizes if they win. So USOC is using some money for that. USOC is also a large operation and have to pay their salary and staff. So that's basically what goes on.
On the revenue point itself, there's a lot going on in sports with streaming, with these rights packages. We've seen the NFL and the NBA and what they were able to attract. How have the Olympics fared over time? I think there's some debate with NBC in particular and what they've done with Peacock, and they may be paying a lot, but there's a question in terms of what that actually results in terms of viewership. But is there any trend line that's noteworthy as it relates to the revenue associated with those rights for the Olympics?
Yeah, they've gone up. Whether they'll continue to go up or not is an open question. I think we see pretty clearly in the United States that there's a fragmentation in the traditional media markets. NBC used to have two competitors, CBS and ABC, and then they had three when Fox came along. But now they've got YouTube and Netflix and Amazon and streamers galore. So the audience is getting fragmented. It makes it more difficult for the NBC to feel like it's justified to lay out more and more money when the number of viewers is going down steadily. So I would be much more cautious in thinking about what the future revenue streams are going to be, even though if you look backwards, you see that there's been a very steady trend upward. My own sense is that party is over. On the positive side, they might see flat revenues, but I also think there's a chance they'll see diminishing media revenues.
I think you painted a good picture of what worked well for LA. You alluded to Barcelona also being a success story or a positive outcome in terms of hosting those 92 Olympics. Feels like a very different case than LA, just in terms of the infrastructure they had. So what would you point to there in terms of being successful and what led to that being a positive outcome for Barcelona?
The trick for Barcelona and the trick for any city that wants to go forward is that because the Olympics asks you to contort itself in all of these different ways to accommodate its demands, you're not going to have a good experience. But if you, instead of letting the Olympics dictate to you what gets built and where it gets built, if you have your own plan that says this is what our city needs, the Olympics has nothing to do with this. Just we're going to sit down and we're going to use our democratically elected or appointed planning bodies to figure out what our city needs to develop going forward. And you develop that plan. And then you say, oh, by the way, this looks like it could fit in very nicely with hosting the games. And in fact, hosting the games we'll be able to attract some resources that will facilitate the implementation of our plan. Then you get the Olympics to work for you rather than you working for the Olympics. So if you can flip the coin like that, then you're in good shape. That, in my view, is largely what happened in Barcelona. Barcelona had a variety of negative outcomes as well, such as knocking out a good deal of low-priced housing or affordable housing. But they were able, after Franco died, Franco was their more or less dictator for roughly 4 decades. He dies in 1975. He had neglected the northeast of the country. Without any government oversight and government planning, Barcelona had basically developed a warehousing and manufacturing sector that fell right on the water. Barcelona is a port town, and it blocked the city. The warehousing and manufacturing blocked the city from its access to the water. And after Franco dies, they take the position that we've got to move this warehousing and manufacturing district. We want to have access to the sea for a variety of reasons, for commercial reasons and aesthetic reasons and reasons to promote tourism successfully. So they design a plan to reconstruct, redesign, reorient their city. It involves new roads. It involves other things. And they make the Olympic bid fit into their plan. So I think that they reversed this typical dynamic. Instead of working for the IOC, they made the IOC work for them. So I think that was the story of Barcelona's success. And what you see in Barcelona is a renewed commitment to their tourist agencies and a fantastic spurt in tourism, where they go from the 20th or 21st most popular city in Europe to visit to the top 3, where they still pretty much are today.
It's interesting to see the positive story, and I like the framing that you had there. I do wonder how many cities or locations would be able to or are looking for that type of transformation and could use the Olympics as a way to get there. It feels like it's probably a limited subset of places where that could work out.
Sure, it's limited. And you have to ask yourself the question, if our city needs X, Y, and Z, why don't we just do X, Y, and Z? Why do we have to drag the Olympics along to do X, Y, and Z? And that's normally what happens. I was quite involved against the New York City bid to host the games in 2016. And the business interests that got behind it were business interests that wanted to do development on the west side of Manhattan between 30 and 33rd Street and 10th and 11th Avenues. What that area was in New York City was open rail yards. And what they wanted to do was to build the Olympic Stadium. In order to build the Olympic Stadium, you'd have to build a concrete slab that cost $400 million in order to put stuff on top of it. And in order to do that, you needed to get rezoning in the area. But because they were bidding to host the Olympics and they had to show the IOC the viability of their plan, they got the rezoning. Once they got the rezoning, they didn't really care very much about whether they hosted the games or not. So now what we have in that part of Manhattan is redevelopment. We have mixed commercial development on those blocks.
Interesting to know what the real underlying desire is, and maybe you could just tackle that initially. Going back to the Barcelona point and tourism, that's often cited as one of the main drivers of longer-term economic success. Is Barcelona a standalone case, the exception to the rule? Has tourism over the long term been a benefit to cities that host the Olympics?
I think the general answer is no. First of all, what tends to happen during the Olympic Games themselves, the 17 days of the Games, is that you do get a flooding in of Olympic tourists and Olympic participants, but you also get a flooding out of normal tourism. You can see that today with Paris. The bookings at the hotels are down. Hotel capacity utilization is lower than it was this time last year, substantially lower. Airport turnover, number of people using the airport, is substantially down. Normal tourism is staying away. Why? Normal tourism stays away because there's going to be commotion and congestion, because there are security issues, because prices tend to be higher. People say, I'm going to take my summer vacation somewhere else this year. So you saw in London in 2012, tourism was down roughly 5 or 6%. In Beijing in 2008, it was down roughly 20%. It's going to be down in Paris this year. Now, there are some cases, I think Rio in 2016 is actually one such case, where low-income tourists flood into the country during the Olympic Games. And in Rio, they stayed at the beaches and they used the outhouses at the beach to take care of themselves. They didn't spend very much money, but the number of people entering the country was a little higher in 2016 than it was in other years. So it's possible that the influx of Olympic tourism could outweigh the outflux of other tourism and local residents wanting to get out of the city. It's possible that balance could go either way. But more typically, in recent years, you've seen a net reduction in tourism during the Games. However, the other claim that often gets made with regard to tourism is that because you're getting put on the world stage, that going forward, more and more people will be desirous of traveling to your city. And I think that claim has been shown pretty much to be nonsense. People don't go to a city because they hosted a 100-meter running race or because they hosted the Olympic basketball competitions. That's not why people go. And in fact, the opposite phenomenon happens, which is that if you talk to tourism agencies, such as the ETOA, European Tourist Agency, they'll tell you that the best way to promote tourism is word of mouth. So in other words, you go to visit Paris and then you come home and you talk to your friends, neighbors, and relatives and you say, hey, I went to the Jeu de Paume Museum, or I went to the Luxembourg Gardens, and I went to the Centre Pompidou, or whatever you've done. And you explain why you're excited about that. And then your friends, gee, that sounds great. Oh, and there are good restaurants, and there's this and there's that. And so your friends want to go to Paris, and that builds tourism. But if you go to the games in the coming weeks, if you go to the Olympics in Paris, you come back, and what do you have to report? Well, you have to report there's a lot of traffic. You paid a lot of money for your hotel, and you saw some great competitions, which aren't going to be around in the future for your friends to see anymore. So you lose your word of mouth promotion of the city when you substitute Olympic tourists for normal tourists. So yes, there are exceptions like Barcelona, but a more typical case is there is no bank. There's no bank to tourism from hosting the games.
Really expensive marketing campaign for the tourism industry. I think a lot of that resonates. The other common thing that's point to is jobs and labor. There's obviously a pickup as you are building out for the games. But what does that look like longer term? Do those jobs go away? Is there any type of stability to that or retention in terms of the labor pickup that happens from hosting the games?
So again, enormous amount of construction goes along with hosting the games. Usually so much construction that it way overshoots the supply of skilled construction workers, and they have to import workers from outside other cities in the country or outside the country altogether. So if the construction sector starts out being less than fully employed, you might be able to drive it to full employment. If it starts out at being fully employed, you'll drive it to inflation. The demand will be so great for the workers that they're going to have to start raising wages, and it'll create more inflation in the country. But more generally, the issue is that in order to do the construction in the early years, you've got to borrow money. You have to issue bonds, you go into debt, and then you have to do debt service. You have to pay interest and principal on the bonds that you issued. And as you have to pay back the bonds, the city has less money to engage in other construction projects, less money to invest in their school system. And that means fewer workers will be hired. There is somewhat of an effect of a trade-off. You get more employment today and possibly with inflationary pressures, but you get less employment down the road. So it only makes sense to do these construction projects if there's something sustainable, if it's recommended from the standpoint of economic development for the city, not from the standpoint of let's generate a few extra jobs in the short run. Now, that might make sense for a politician. A politician wants to get reelected, so generate a lot of jobs in the short run before the election. That can make sense. Hosting the Olympics can also make sense to a politician because he or she is going to get a lot of exposure nationally and internationally. But that's a very different issue than doing something that's constructive in terms of economic development for the city.
There's often incentives that don't show up on spreadsheets that can lead to these types of situations. This has been an excellent analysis and history lesson in terms of what's going on. I thought to wrap it up, it would be good to hear your thoughts on a potential solution or some type of operating method that could make this into a more sustainable operation in the future.
So if the world wants to keep the Olympics, then I think the most rational way to do it is to have one designated site to host the Summer Games every 4 years and another designated site to host the Winter Games, so we don't have to rebuild the entire Olympic infrastructure and make cities contort themselves and use resources that don't need to be used. So if we were, as an example, pick a site of 300 or 400 acres in Greece between Athens and Olympia and build the Olympic Shangri-La there, and use it every 4 years for the Olympics. And in between, use it for smaller competitions or use it as an athletic training center. I think that would make a lot more sense rationally for the environment and for financing, for economics. We're a long ways from doing that because all of this ultimately is controlled by the IOC. And the IOC, as I explained earlier, has a bunch of members who have their own agenda, and they're not thinking about global warming or true economic sustainability. So that would be one solution. My friend David Goldblatt, who's an Olympic and sports historian and an excellent one, recently came out with an article where he argues, no, let's just end the Olympics. We can still have athletic competitions. We don't have to convene everybody in the same city for 17 days. And let's make a statement that this is just too wasteful in terms of use of resources and the planet to continue to do this the way we have in the past. In any event, the modern games were started in 1896. It was at a time when there was no international travel, no international telecommunications. And it was necessary back then, if we wanted to engage the entire world and have the entire world participate in and enjoy the Olympics, we had to move the games around. Because of international telecommunications, we don't need to do that anymore. And that old model doesn't make sense. So I do think if we are going to keep the Olympics, and I'm one who believes that there are some virtues to the games and that they're fun in any event, if we are going to keep them, I think we should do it in a way that's more rational. And the most rational way to do that is to have one host.
Consider my vote to be cast on your side as well, but some thoughtful framing there. This has been excellent. Again, Andy, really appreciate you joining us and sharing the particularly timely knowledge on this topic.
Okay, Matt, my pleasure.
To find more episodes of breakdowns ranging from Costco to Visa to Moderna, or to sign up for our weekly summary, check out joincolossus.com. That's JoinColossus.com.